Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the All Saints podcast. Today I have another special guest for you who I had the opportunity to interview earlier today. Had a great conversation with Mr. Nate Douglas. Nate is one of the deacons here at All Saints Presbyterian Church, and he and I picked up a podcast episode that I'd put out a few weeks ago now on the subject of education. Specifically, you may recall, if you're a regular listener to this podcast or a regular viewer of the videos that accompany it, that I highlighted some potential pitfalls that may be found in, well, I highlighted specifically the classical Christian education tradition, although the pitfalls could be found elsewhere. It's just that I've encountered them once or twice, particularly potently in relation to that tradition. And therefore, though that educational approach is one that I'm an enthusiastic advocate of, and indeed my wife Nicole and I chose to select that kind of educational framework for our children, I wanted to raise one or two potential dangers that it might have. I'm not going to go into the details because I do that at the start of the interview. But the conversation I had with Nate arose from just an email exchange he and I had, and then a subsequent conversation in which he wanted to say, well, hold on a second, there's probably some more different perspectives on this question that would be helpful to hear. And so we talked and I listened and I thought, actually, yeah, there's some very interesting and helpful things that we could think about there, particularly connected with the overarching aims of not just classical Christian education, but all education, namely the formation of Christian character, and how that feeds into the important matter of vocation, which is to say what people end up spending most of the rest of their lives doing once they've finished their formal education as young people. And then there were also some other conversations we had about the different priorities at different stages of a young person's growth, and what they do in their teenage years and what they do as young adults, 18 through 21 and beyond, how those things might differ and vary depending on their particular aptitude and abilities and skills and so on. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff which just goes to show how deep this rabbit hole goes and how worthwhile I think it is for us to be constantly thinking about this. It's a particular pressing priority for people who themselves are young people, or for you if you're a parent and you're educating your own children, and if you're a prospective future parent, and who knows how many of you might be in that category, even if you're not a parent right now. The Lord may bless you in future with marriage, if you're not married, and with children, if you don't yet have children. And I hope, therefore, that this issue of education is something which is a priority for everybody to be reflecting on. So I don't want to say much more by way of introduction. I'm going to hand you over to the interview recording that Nate and I made earlier. I want to thank him for his participation and for raising the questions. I think it was really helpful. I think in the end, we certainly didn't end up disagreeing at all, but there were some additional elements to the picture which it was very helpful to put in place and to flesh out. And I think particularly as education relates to virtue and godliness, and how godliness and virtue relate to our callings in life, professional callings as well as family callings, and how the issue of the quality of our education factors into all those discussions. There's a whole bunch of practical stuff there which I won't preempt any further, other than to say I hope you enjoy the rest of the podcast, and God bless. Bye for now. Well, hello everybody and welcome to the All Saints podcast. I'm here with Nate Douglas, who is one of the deacons here at All Saints. Welcome, Nate. Great to have you with us.
Glad to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Well, listen, it's great to have you here. This conversation arose because of a podcast that came out a few weeks ago in which I addressed the subject of classical Christian education. And I made some comments there about some potential pitfalls for this approach to teaching and raising young people. And you had some comments about that, some more perspectives you wanted to bring, and I thought it'd be great just to have a conversation and allow others to listen in, so to speak, because I think the points you made were really good points. I think it'd be helpful for other people to hear them. So if it's okay, I'll just begin by recapping what I said a few weeks ago, and then I'll ask you just to jump in, Nate, and talk me through how you think you'd want to nuance or add to, or even if you think I got something wrong, push back against what I said. But here's what I had to say just a couple of weeks ago, briefly. First, what is classical Christian education? Well, roughly speaking, I think it can be defined by at least two characteristics. The first is a methodology, which I'd talked about before. Dorothy Sayers talked about grammar, logic, rhetoric, by which she meant something like teach the facts of a subject in the early years, then in the middle years, teach how a subject fits together, how the facts of a subject fit together, the logical relationships between ideas. And then as the end of high school approaches, you're moving towards rhetoric, the stage at which you're asking young people to be creative in articulating the ideas that they've learned. And then in a subsequent podcast, again quite recently, I talked with Josh Taylor at Grace Classical Christian Academy in Granbury, and I suggested that actually what Miss Sayers has found back in the mid-20th century is a reflection of a biblical paradigm, priest-king-prophet, where priest-king-prophet roughly follows grammar, logic, rhetoric. Okay, so the first feature of classical Christian education is that it has that kind of pedagogical structure. The second is a particular kind of content, and I wanted to highlight a focus on ancient literature, the things that have arisen from the long history of Western civilization as it's been shaped by the scriptures. So in a sense, when it comes to content, scripture is at the heart of, the root of what is explored in classical Christian education. But it also, you'd expect people who are following that educational paradigm to be self-consciously looking for the beauty and the goodness of God's creative and providential work in the great works of literature and art and architecture and so on and so forth throughout the history of Western civilization. And all that is focused then on glorifying God for the things that he has made. And so that's, roughly speaking, at least the two characteristics of classical Christian education that I drew attention to. Now, I know you want to add something to that, but the danger that I wanted to draw attention to was so commending that as to be, in effect, or even explicitly, derogatory towards vocational training. So it's a real pity, it seems to me, when you have people who are involved in classical Christian education speaking in a way which is negative of someone who trains to be a plumber, or someone who trains to be an accountant, or somebody who leaves school at 17 or 18 and goes off to do a degree in engineering or pre-med or something, because what they want to be is an engineer or a doctor or an accountant or a plumber or a salesman or something. And the reason I think that's a mistake is, firstly, it's theological, because as the Reformers rediscovered, Scripture places a very high value on the vocational callings that men and women have, whether as mums and dads, husbands and wives, and in a workplace. A man who works in a steel warehouse, the guy who comes into this building to spray the gunk in the corners of the room to kill the cockroaches, somebody who designs a bridge or fills in your tax return for you. All these things are dignified callings in the sight of God. And I think it's a crying shame when somebody says, in the pursuit of commending study of ancient literature, is it implicitly or explicitly derogatory or critical of the vocational tradition that we've inherited really from our Reformed forebears, and I want to encourage people to pursue. And there's a deep-seated practical eschatological concern as well, which is it is a vital aspect of being ready to be a great husband and father and mother and wife, to be able to provide. Now, if you can't get a job, you're probably not going to be able to get married and raise your children well and provide for them the kind of education that you want to have to provide for them. So that's the concern I had. My fear, just to encapsulate it, try and encapsulate it in one sentence, then Nate, you're sitting very patiently listening. I think it would be a wonderful thing to commend classical Christian education as one potential Christian educational path, the one that Nicole, my wife, and I, in various ways, tried to pursue with our children. A great thing to commend that, but a terrible mistake to commend it at the expense of commending vocational training for those reasons. So That's a summary of my bleats from a few weeks ago. Nate, you had some thoughts about that, and I'd love to hear them.
Sure. So among those bleats, to be clear, you wanted a world where you'd have both and, right? So it's very important that you have both of those components, and I 100% agree with you with all of those statements that you just made. I think some additional layers could be added to fine-tune and even hone in and make your argument more pointed. So I'm glad we're getting in a chat now.
Yeah.
With the classical education, you summarized well, I think a kind of a 30,000-foot view of methodology, content. I think it would be helpful to unpack and bring greater clarity to the function and purpose of the methodology and content.
Right.
So the whole purpose of classical education is to help students to grow in wisdom, discernment, and inculcate virtue. And you can do those things with feeding their souls with good things. And by good things, obviously, Scripture needs to be at the center of it. If Scripture is not at the center of any so-called classical education, it's not. It's certainly not a Christian one, but I would argue it's not a classical one either.
Right. In one sense, then, so you said this earlier when we were talking before this, but the Bible is the preeminent classical text.
Indeed.
In that it's the root of all that is good in the Western classical tradition, as well as every other tradition. Right?
Exactly. And so it's very important that that be at the center of it, and it's not, I would say, Christian or classical fit. That was not the case.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of other great works of literature, art, music, and so forth that, as you mentioned in the previous podcast episode, certainly help Christians gain a greater appreciation of God and His creation, what is good, what is beautiful. But I think what is really important in the purpose of this kind of education is that they are soul-changing and soul-shaping that's going on. So when you listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or if you read Augustine's Confessions, you should be a different man or woman after you've listened or read those things or seen a particular painting.
Right.
It's supposed to be, you're supposed to be different because just like we do in everyday, like we do at Sunday worship, for example, the Lord's table changes us.
Right, yes.
But obviously, as a sacrament, it's supposed to have that function, but even just the acts of singing together with other people, singing God's word, psalms, the act of confession, listening to God's word being preached, those are all soul-changing and feeding too. And so in the same way, classical education is functioning where when you are feeding good things to your students, you are shaping them to be better husbands,
it's about
fathers.
Character. It's about virtue.
It's all about that.
So let me make a couple of comments about that. I mean, the first is I accept the point. In other words, I think definitionally, absolutely, I would accept that third strand to the definition of what classical Christian education is trying to accomplish. And that actually highlights a second point, which is that much of what we're saying here bleeds into other Christian educational approaches. Sometimes we can talk about classical Christian education or some other kind of Christian education as though they exist in hermetically sealed boxes.
Yes, right.
But it's kind of, I mean, that's a mistake. Clearly, any thought through approach to Christian education is trying to form a certain sort of person. It's about character. And even non-Christian educational paradigms are trying to create a certain sort of person, just not the right sort of person, ultimately.
Right.
And so I think it's interesting, because that also highlights that, you know, other aspects of the description, perhaps it's a better thing to call it a description than a definition, description of classical Christian education that I offered would be found in other paradigms as well. I think that's the point I made. So, you know, somebody who's not self-consciously following Dorothy Sayers' grammar, logic, rhetoric, or the biblical priest, king, prophet, might well teach their kid a bunch of facts when they're young and then help them to sort them out and figure out how they go together when they're 10 or 11 and then teach them to write well when they're 14 or 15. I mean, that
certainly. Or
they might teach them Latin, which obviously is a key component of the content of this. So I guess the point I'm making is thus far, like total agreement. Very glad to hear you say that.
Yes.
Talk to me about how you see that virtue point interacting with the vocational point that I was wanting to make previously.
Right, and that's why I wanted to bring that up, because, again, if we can lay down the proper foundation for how we're defining classical education and the purpose of it, then we can better inform your argument about the vocational component. So, obviously, if the whole purpose of classical education is to inculcate virtue in our children and in our students, then they in turn can turn that and take that into their vocational training later.
Right.
So a lesson that in conversation I had with one of my children just recently was about trustworthiness and responsibility.
Right.
If those lessons aren't being taught now, he's not going to be given responsible positions at his workplace down the road, and subsequently the people that are not trustworthy with, people that cannot be trusted with important roles or tasks don't make as much money, if they even can keep their job at all.
So being a virtuous person, being a godly person. So I recognize the term virtue. We sometimes think of as a term that's connected with the classical tradition. It's actually a biblical term.
Certainly,
it's just right there in the New Testament.
Yes,
it's in 1 Peter 1. So the point you'd be making is, like, you're not going to be a good plumber if you're not honest. You're not going to be a good airline pilot if you're not careful, cautious, conscientious, loving. You're not going to be a good accountant if you've not got that kind of scrupulous attention to detail. You're not going to be a good engineer if you've not worked really hard to make sure you understand what it is that you're building, that people are driving 10,000 cars a day across. So to push your point further, perhaps you'd want to say, I'm putting words in your mouth now, but if we really believe in vocational education, we must find some way of getting the outcome in terms of Christian virtues and godliness that is the whole goal of the classical Christian approach to education. Would that be right?
Exactly, and that's what I want for my children, the whole purpose of this, so that they have the proper tools to handle any vocation that they decide to pursue, as well as be, this goes outside the scope of a little bit, but be good husbands, fathers, church members, community members.
Yes.
Those are all equally as important. It's great to be, obviously, at your job, but if you're a crummy husband when you get home, or father, there's issues there too.
Right. So in one sense, I think this is really encouraging, because what it says to all of us who are parents, and actually all those who are children studying, whatever self-conscious approach to education you're taking, if it's Christian, it is aimed at the formation of character.
Yes.
Classical Christian, maybe we'll come to that in a second. Why does the classical Christian education tradition think that this is a particular way to get to character? But we all want to get to character, and that is in no way a divergent priority from vocational training. It's like soldiers should not be trained to have either a right leg or a left leg, or recruited with we need both legs.
Yes.
We need plumbers to be great at plumbing and honest, scrupulously hardworking, conscientious people. And so the virtue is an aspect of the vocational training.
Right.
Now, just behind this, and this is a slight side tangent, but I think it might be helpful. Do you want to say anything about why the classical Christian education tradition sees this particular path to forming Christian virtue as particularly fruitful? Because to put it most crudely, like somebody who says, well, we're not giving our kids a classical education, but we're definitely trying to form virtue. What would a classical bit add to that?
So definitely want to put the classic into classical with this argument, where the whole purpose of studying classical is, you can focus on works of art, literature, history, music, where these things are relevant today, and they have lasted today because they are good in and of themselves. So they've stood this test of time, and you could, at a basic level, say because they've stood the test of time, they're in a sense good and valuable for us to utilize because in many cases they're 2,000, 1,500, 1,000 years old.
Right. The filter of history has been applied and has weeded out the garbage.
Indeed.
Right.
So we can still listen to Bach and be in awe right now.
Yeah.
Whereas if we were to listen to Billie Eilish 20 years from now, if she's even relevant at all.
Yeah. I've often thought this about Christian music, by the way. It's kind of parenthetic. Maybe it's illustrative. So sometimes people might ask, why is it that we act as though the only decent Christian music that has ever been written was written hundreds of years ago? Because there's loads of Christian music being written today.
Right.
And my answer to that is always, well, look more closely at lots of really old hymn books. You'll find they're full of garbage.
Yes.
People write bad music at roughly the same rate throughout history, as far as I can make out.
Yes.
It's just that most of the stuff from the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and even some from the 19th century that was really terrible, has been weeded out, so that only the good stuff remains. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you buy a hymn book or a songbook, because it probably would be a songbook, let's face it, that it contains only songs written in the last 20 years, the filter of history hasn't done its job. So all the garbage is mixed in there with a bunch of stuff. There might be half a dozen really good tunes, really good songs, great words, but there's also going to be 500 things that you just want to, you're waiting for the history to roll on so we can forget that we ever sang Shine Jesus Shine, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, okay. So I'm with you. And so and this is one of the things that intrigues me, and just as I'm talking to Christians who've adopted different approaches with their own kids, I'm very, very keen to encourage people not to get uptight about the labels so much. I think there is some value in attempting to think about a coherent paradigm like a classical Christian paradigm. Right. But actually, what's almost, I think I probably would say more important is, look, let's not have an argument about classical Christian or some other Christian, but wouldn't it be great to read Augustine's Confessions? Yes. Let's read that. Let's give that to a 12-year-old boy.
Right.
And just see the impact it could have on him. Yes. And ditto with so many other things. Get your children to listen to great music. Get your children to learn to appreciate great art, even if they don't particularly enjoy looking at it or can't paint and draw and so on themselves. Right. They can appreciate great sculpture and painting and so on.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if we work backwards, the argument then would be, in order to achieve virtuous children, which enriches your argument of vocation, right, we need to surround them and feed their souls good things so that their souls are changed for the better.
Yeah. And that's potentially so powerful. If you think about what are you really looking for, if you're asking for a recommendation for somebody to service your car or to install a new roof or to install an irrigation system or do some work that you don't understand on your house, you want two things. You want competence and you want honesty.
Right.
Or character more broadly. And so the competence and character, maybe, I don't think we should try and do so now, but I wonder if that's a helpful analytical framework for thinking about vocational training. Competence and character. So the classical element is one particularly focused route towards the character point.
Yes, definitely. Okay.
You had some other things you wanted to say, just to what I don't know, nuance. I've not detected any disagreement yet, but go ahead if you do. But in response to my previous podcast a few weeks ago, you had some other thoughts you wanted to feed in.
Yeah, sure. So I think to fine-tune your argument even more, which I think is 100% valid, it is important to distinguish the type of classical education it's directed towards. Right. So we've spent a bit of time here discussing what classical education is, the purpose of it, what it consists of. The episode you did with Mr. Taylor recently on the progression of maturity and priest, king, prophet was another great example of that. Now, to fine-tune your argument even more, I think we need to distinguish the vocational component and where parents and people should be considering that more in what stage of life. So obviously you're not directing your vocational argument to 12-year-olds, right?
Right.
12-year-olds, like in this discussion, they still have a lot of growth and maturity, wisdom, and virtue that needs to occur. And in addition to that, if they want to start their own lawn mowing business, they need to actually be good at math, right?
Right.
So we're not...
or at least better at math than some 12-year-olds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the argument obviously is not addressed to 12-year-olds. I think it would be a much more effective argument if we were talking about education at the college level.
Right, okay.
So obviously people in high school, vocational training could start to enter the picture. They can actually legally work in many cases, but obviously a lot of educational groundwork is being laid. But once they're done with high school, then I think your argument for vocational training really can start to take off.
Right.
And so it's important, I think, to distinguish that collegiate level education and the purpose of it is really important versus high school, junior high, kindergarten, younger grades.
So at this point, I think it's interesting because there is something. It's not 100% arbitrary. I don't want to say it's arbitrary, but there is something somewhat arbitrary about making an absolute claim, that your vocational education or your specifically focused vocational training, competence in plumbing, competence as an engineer, competence as a doctor, competence as an accountant, shouldn't begin until you are post-college, 21, or post-high school, 18, or maybe 16. It feels to me there isn't a hard line that I'd want to apply to everybody.
Right. Everyone's different.
Right. And so part of what we want to do then is to acknowledge that we need to be ready to respond to different students with different character, temperament, ambitions, academic abilities, and so on. And you can easily see what the outcome of that might be. So somebody who's just not very academic, but really, really, really wants to be a craftsman or in the skilled trades and is already really good at it, age 16 or 17, you might make a case then for saying, well, let's try and get some vocational training, high-quality vocational training, if their character is ready for that earlier. Whereas somebody of a more academic bent, what would you say? Would you want to encourage people who are more academically minded to continue classical Christian education, liberal arts training into a tertiary level, or do you not want to make that generalization?
I probably would not want to make that generalization just because it could get so tricky with regards to what the child in question wants to do.
Right.
So I have a child who's certainly not academically focused, we can already tell. And so my wife and I are already having discussions about what's the best way to set him up for hands-on, like craft tradesman type jobs.
Great. Yeah.
At the same time, we want to give him the quality of education where we don't feel like he needs to go for a tertiary education and have additional classical as part of that. For other children, it obviously could vary. I certainly would recommend it if they wanted to have a career in classical education.
Yes.
But it does come to a point where I would say you maybe do not need to pursue it.
Yeah. Why would you keep going?
Why would you keep going when you've already had, one would hope, a very solid level of that type of education?
So here's what it's interesting. I've had a number of conversations with very experienced educators in the college level in the liberal arts, who I respect immensely, who've said, and I'll try and paraphrase them, it's like the best argument that I've heard from them is we're all in favour of vocational education, but not for an 18-year-old, because there is still too much they haven't yet done. They need 3-4 years more. They'll benefit so much from a liberal arts degree. And we all know there are multiple institutions now in the US. And there's some that we know well, New St. Andrews in Moscow. People at All Saints have been to Hillsdale, at least one person who's been to Hillsdale. Anthony Esselin in his book that we read, I forget the
Out of the Ashes.
Out of the Ashes, yeah, we read this part of a book group a couple of years ago. lists a whole bunch of liberal arts colleges, Protestant, Catholic, all across the US,
Right.
that are in different ways rediscovering the liberal arts degree tradition, and some of them have been around for many decades.
Mm-hmm.
So, my friends would say, give your budding accountant, your budding engineer, your budding airline pilot, whatever it is, get them through a liberal arts education all the way to 21,
Mm-hmm.
and then go to trade school, or then go to do a degree in engineering, or then go to train with American Airlines, and then go to train as an accountant.
Right.
And your suggestion is that's a generalization too far?
I definitely would say that. Of course, it depends, again, on the person in
Right.
question,
Okay.
their maturity level. I went to one of the schools you mentioned previously, and it certainly benefited me.
Right.
I got a lot out of it. I needed that, and so I'm
Yes.
very thankful for it.
Yeah.
At the same time, it can be very redundant.
You can tell us which school you went to.
Yeah, so I went to New St. Andrews
Yeah,
College, and we have like 4 or 5 people now that
At
are
All
going
Saints?
from there.
Yeah,
Yes, here at All
that's
Saints.
right. That's right.
But at the same time, so my wife went there too, and
Yeah,
certainly
yeah.
she thought a lot of it was redundant, and
Right.
she did have a pretty thorough classical education
Right,
as she
okay,
was growing
okay.
up. So I definitely would push back against the redundancy component of it. It may not be necessary at all for some people, and they can go straight to those
Right,
vocations that they want
Right.
to pursue. It comes down to the maturity level of that person, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So I have several siblings that have gone to secular, quote unquote, schools,
Yes.
and they're active church members and providing for their families and doing a
Yeah.
magnificent job.
Yeah.
And they didn't have that liberal arts education.
So I think this is fascinating because it raises in my mind a bunch of questions and observations really. And so if I'll I don't know, go through them one at a time and you tell me what you think. And the first is there's just a financial aspect to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're planning to, let's say, train as an engineer, you're not going to train to be an engineer at a Christian liberal arts university. You're going to have to go to somewhere else, which
Yes.
means that you're saying, okay, well, I'll go to a liberal arts school, and that's basically an extra 3 years or 4 years not earning, plus the fees and costs
Mm-hmm.
and so on.
Yes.
So if cost were no object and you weren't in a rush, I would
Right.
say, well, go for it.
Absolutely.
But the problem is there's no free lunch. There's no trade-off free decisions. Every decision you make to do one thing is a decision not to do something else. Every dime you spend on one thing, you're not spending on something else. And you're certainly, if you're spending money on education, you're not earning money
Yes.
and saving money. And it seems to me unfortunate when it's almost like it would be possible to overstate the case for anything by ignoring its downsides.
Yes.
And classical education and Christian education generally are such blessings, we don't need to overstate the case for them by pretending there's no downside. Even
Right.
if it's good value, it still costs time and money.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thought.
That's the exact same
Right.
thought I have
Right.
too. So it's if you're married or about to be married and you expect to have children pretty
Right.
quick,
You probably need to earn some money,
yes,
not spend some.
rather than go into another 5, 6, 7, 8
Right,
years of
right.
school. And obviously, some people do that, and they can make it work.
Right.
It's a
right.
very hard 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
Right. Yes.
So-
and again, that would depend on circumstances.
Yes.
So, and a related point, and this is the second observation I wanted to make, is I want to push back by saying the case for classical Christian education up to 21 is not that it's claiming too much, it's claiming too little. I want people to be reading great books
Yes.
and growing in character in a way that reflects the whole biblical saturated Christian tradition that we're a part of.
Right.
Until they are 95 or 114 or however long they live.
Right.
I don't want us to think we should do the classical education up to 21 and then we've got it done. And I know that the best classical educators don't think that.
Right.
But given that you've got to stop somewhere, what I'd love to see is a disposition towards a love of learning
Mm-hmm.
and a love of scripture and a love of great theology and art and music and everything else that permeates adult life, and then that will seep down into the children. I was reading just recently, in fact I've got it over there, I won't grab it because I'll leave the microphone and make a noise, but Teddy Roosevelt president, early 20th century, wrote a letter to a friend of his, a Nobel laureate, I forget the guy's name, in response to a question about what he's reading. And he wrote this list of like 100 books that he had read or reread in the first 2 years of his presidency, between 1901 and 1903, I think. And it was just Greek classics, and it was massive multi-volume histories of the ancient world and biographies of kings and queens you'd never heard of, and great literature, along with a bunch of novels that he thought were too ephemeral to mention and embarrassing to. And I just thought, there's a man who is, I mean, it's not like he's got nothing to do, President of the United States, but he's somehow been gripped by a love for lifelong learning. And I so want to encourage that in all the parents, because that will filter down to the children, right?
Certainly, and that's something that I try to encourage among my friends, parents specifically, who have children enrolled in a classical school, as well as encourage the parents, particularly the dads here at the Oaks, where it's very important that the classical education they're giving in children does not just take place down the halls here, but at home.
Yes,
and then to a lesser extent, I mean, not to a lesser extent. I downplay this more, but in these conversations, but it needs to be taking place at these parents' churches as well. Right. But at home, as an example, so I collect vinyl records.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
You're a whiskey drinker and you collect vinyl records. I like you more all the time, mate.
You're welcome to come anytime and share in those experiences. So the whole, one of the reasons why I wanted to do that was to show, first off, children, look, this is music, and it's on this vinyl black disc, and it's not in this magical, ethereal world where you push a button and then it comes on the speaker and it's there, and you have access to everything, right? So in a sense, it helps ground them.
Yes.
But also, and sure, I have a lot of the classics. I was able to find an original pressing of Fleetwood Mac's Rumors a couple of weeks ago, and I was very pumped about that. But I have a big collection of Handel's Messiah, St. Matthew's Passion. For Columbus Day, we were listening to Dvorak's The New World. So that's just one example of one way you can share in the classical experience and give it to your children at home. But it's not just doing it for your children. I'm being shaped by this myself. Sure. Leah is being shaped by it.
You can't pass on what you are not yourself in that way. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I'm not just doing it for them. I'm still being shaped by these things. Last year, Leah and I went on a Shakespeare binge, and we didn't read, but we watched maybe 14 different Shakespeare film adaptations.
Wow.
And it's...
Did you watch Henry V, the one with, who's the guy who plays Lockhart in Harry Potter, the English one?
Oh, Kenneth Branagh?
Yeah.
Yes. So we watched 3 different versions of Henry V, and then we watched 3 different versions of Hamlet.
And he's like 28 years old or something when he does that speech. He's amazing, isn't he?
He is. It's greatness. So, but that's equally important for parents too. It doesn't stop.
Right. Yeah.
The Robert Farrar Capon's The Supper of the Lamb, his book, so good on talking about this element of enriching your home and being very intentional with the things that you are surrounded by, listening to, reading to, or in his case, since it's particularly focused on gastronomy, what you're eating and actually consuming and tasting. Yeah. Those things, again, it goes back to soul changing, soul improvement, feeding your soul, in some cases literally, where you are becoming a better person of it. So it never stops, is the point. Like you just got up.
So sorry, cutting you off. I didn't mean to. Okay, so what you're, I think again we're in agreement, and what we've got is, it always makes me laugh whenever anybody mentions Capon's book now, that I always think of The Onion.
Yes.
And I talked to Pastor Josh Apple, who's at Trinity Reformed Church in Moscow, who teaches a course in what he calls, is it aesthetic gastronomy?
I was one of his students, yes.
Right, and he's just, if you ever get a chance to listen to Josh, anybody listening to this, whoever has a chance to go and hear Josh preach or go and study under him, if you can, he's just a wonderful, wonderful teacher, pastor, preacher, everything. And he has such a kind of incendiary love for the things that God has made and for the privilege of teaching them. It's just, and it sets adults on fire with love for those things, just as it does, I'm sure, his students.
Certainly.
Right.
Yes, and you can definitely, just if we want to sing praises of Josh Happel for a minute. I mean,
we love you, Josh. But
just YouTube him.
It's great.
There's so much gold, Jerry. There's gold.
Well, let me just, because I want to take a few more minutes. Got to take a few more minutes from you, because I want to pick up a potential objection, which Nicole, my wife, and I have been sensitive to in thinking about our own kids. So we have, most of you know this, our son Ben is 18, pushing 19. He just started college. We've got 2 daughters who are looking in that direction. And one of the things that we were acutely sensitive to is the obvious point, which is made by many in the tertiary classical Christian tradition, that frankly, some universities are not a great place to go to get your worldview shaped.
Right.
So, what I do think, again, the best way to make the case for some people going to a secular university to study math or physics or engineering or something is not to try and overstate it. I think, as a father whose son has taken that route, I want to concede, yes, there are many, many places where it would be an absolute unmitigated catastrophe for some Christian young people to go to study anything, STEM, history, English. Right. Many secular universities are so contaminated with un-Christian ideologies that, especially in the humanities, but increasingly in some science disciplines and engineering and so on, right, you're getting indoctrinated with all kinds of garbage that you are in no position, for some young people are in no position to filter out. Right. And frankly, even some professedly Christian institutions are worryingly heading leftward or wokeward in all kinds of different areas. So I want to wear that response. I don't think we serve ourselves, we certainly don't serve our young people well by minimizing the potential dangers. I think, to put it most simply, it would be a good idea not to go to certain schools to study certain subjects. I don't think it follows from that it's a bad idea to go to any so professedly non-Christian university to study anything at any age. I think it's just that wisdom and discernment.
Absolutely.
Now, it sounds from what you're saying like within your way of articulating the goals and aims of Christian education and classical Christian education, I think I'm in sympathy with, very strong sympathy with. There's space for that. You'd want to hear those cautions, but you don't think the cautions rule out the whole kind of pursuit of learning in secular institutions, correct?
Correct, yes. And so I think it's important that's why I wanted to draw this distinction.
Right.
I don't think the argument about the focus on vocational training is a hidden danger in that it is juxtaposed against the younger grades. It's obviously much
at the older stages.
Right. It's until you get to the older stages. And like you said, exactly, wisdom and discernment are critical when making those decisions. Because if a parent and a student are confident that a potential college applicant is wise enough to discern and shun what some secular universities will be offering them, and then in turn they can get a good start on the vocation they want to pursue.
Right, then they can do it.
Then they can go do it. But obviously it's a case by case.
Yes, and I think wise parents know this. I think of two different sorts of conversations I have. Some with parents who say, at what age is it okay for a child to be exposed to such and such a secular influence?
Right.
Or what age is it okay for them to go to a secular baseball club? Or what age is it okay for them to go and join a secular orchestra or go to a secular educational institution? And I want to say there's no age.
Right.
It's a whole bunch of different factors which include the character and stability and maturity and wisdom of the person, which is not perfectly correlated with their age.
Right. No, it's not. I mean, you talked about it in your episode with Mr. Taylor.
Yeah.
Not everyone is going to reach their king stage at the same time or same age.
Right, exactly. And that then fits the other kind of conversation I have with parents where they say, our son was definitely mature enough to go to such and such a place, age 18, but we thought his little brother probably wasn't ready. And I think that's very wise. There's no one age fits all for those kinds of decisions.
Exactly. But it should be made, I think, very clear that there shouldn't, if the level of maturity is there to go to the secular university, there shouldn't be any stigmatization of that student.
Well, again, and this is a point where, yes, it's possible that different people might reach different conclusions about, well, is this person quite ready yet? I mean, that's part of what being a parent is. You've got to take responsibility for that. The young person has got to take responsibility. People might differ in where they draw the fuzzy line, but it would be a mistake to say there should be no line.
Right. Absolutely.
I guess, so just one more thing I wanted to raise with you, which is related to this whole set of questions, but is somewhat distinct. We're ignoring, in all of this, the issue of just raw educational quality. The simple fact is, and in some disciplines, it is possible to almost quantify competence, certainly in mathematics and in some of the sciences, but also in terms of, it might not be possible to quantify it so much, but it's possible to analyse a play superficially or to analyse it more deeply. It's possible to draw badly and play a musical instrument badly or play it rather better. And you might not be able to attach numbers, numerical strength to those competencies, but across the whole field of educating young people, one of the things that we ought to be concerned about as an aspect of character, actually, not alongside character, but as part of character, is just how good somebody is. Are they good at math? Because it would be a really bad idea to not care about that. And I know in some sense you can distinguish academic and educational competence from character. It's possible to have a highly godly character and not be academically trained to a high level. Of course that's possible. But neither should we totally detach those things. So I want to say to all the young people, you should be working as hard as you can to get as good as you can at your subjects. And it's no answer to say, yeah, but I can be a godly person without being good at math. So no, you just blew your cover right there.
Right.
Go and do your math homework. So I guess the question I have is something like this. Given that quality, just educational competence, is one of the things we should be concerned about, do you think that the classical Christian tradition distinctively has something to offer here? I mean, obviously it's possible to get really good in all kinds of different traditions. I'm not asking you to criticize other traditions. I'm just trying to say, what do you think the tradition that you're most familiar with has to offer?
Sure. So it's certainly some advantages of the classical education in this type of format is it's very hard to do with just parents by yourselves. So if you can do it in community, especially in a structured environment with the school, where then you can have your children shaped by your teachers that are experts in their fields, that's going to have a much greater impact and be much more effective at delivering that particular curriculum to the students. So, for example, if I want my children to take Bible and theology, I could do it myself.
That'd be great.
Or I could have them take it from you, right? And so that's
kind of you to say.
Yeah, so and this gets at a different component of classical education, and that is the teacher. So you want to have the kinds of teachers that are shaping your students as well. You don't want just the fact that they're reading Augustine and listening to Bach. You don't want those. You want those things to shape your students, but you want to have the quality of teachers where the teachers are shaping the students as well. And so in that sense, you want the quality is extremely important.
Yes.
What the students are learning is only as good as the teacher delivering it at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm with you. So I think what's interesting about that is it raises this whole issue, which I don't think we should try and talk about today. Maybe it's a topic for another podcast, where I'd like to try and help parents, especially parents of younger children, and we have loads of parents of younger children, the kids who haven't really started their formal education yet, I'd like to help them to think through the pros and cons of different approaches.
Right.
And clearly, there is a range of different approaches from homeschooling, different brands of homeschooling, different brands of Christian co-ops and classical conversations, and then classical schools, and then the university model schools that I know you're most familiar with and you're involved in here at the Oaks Tutorials that uses a building here at All Saints. There's a whole bunch of different paradigms, and what sometimes happens is people get really defensive because they think that anybody who talks about something that they're not doing is actually criticizing them.
Right.
Now, I'm absolutely not wanting to do that, and I think maybe what we want to do at some point, not now, stop it, Pastor Jeffrey, is to have a conversation where we're talking about what are the pros and cons, and let's just be honest about it, and not feel defensive or criticized. And I think it is interesting to me that the comments you made, they were really speaking in favor of some form of collaboration or community.
Yes.
Rather than specifically classical. I mean,
right.
We tried to do, mostly on our own, something approaching a kind of classical framework. And some people would say it wasn't classical because you didn't do Latin, you did Greek. Okay, fine. Whatever. I mean, we didn't. And so if that doesn't tick your box, that's fine. Right. But we tried to do something. But we were doing it on our own. And one of the problems we ran into was, well, how do we push the kids? And one of the ways you can do it is just by pushing them yourself. But it's really hard work.
Yes.
And there is a kind of healthy competitiveness, and there's a blessing, like you said, in having people who are more specialist teaching. One of the best experiences we had was when we first started, when we just set up an informal co-op with a number of other families. And it had its challenges, it had its downsides.
Sure.
You got to slow down for the young people who are slower at math. And Nicole, my wife, who taught a lot of math in that context, slowed down a lot.
Right.
But the students got the benefit of, she's a very, very good math teacher. She had a degree in engineering from Oxford. She's good at math, okay?
Yeah.
And also they get the benefit of being together, which has all those character benefits, as well as, the healthy competitiveness between the students. And they think, there is something valuable in that,
Definitely.
And I go on, sorry.
Yes, so God made us to be social and to be in community. That's why we worship together.
Yeah.
And that doesn't stop on Sundays. We are. He has sent us out and placed us in the world to be lights, and we need to be with other people in order to do that.
Yeah.
And in order to be iron that is sharpened, you need to be with another piece of iron, right?
Yeah.
So doing it in community is really important. Music, singing is very important for us, obviously, as Christians and in our worship. And it's not the same when you're doing
a bunch of things you
by
can
yourself
do,
in your house.
You can do together that you can't do alone.
Exactly.
Yeah. Listen, I want to press pause because otherwise we're going to chase down there for another hour or more, and you've got things to do. I've got things to do, and we've been going for 45, 50 minutes, so we should press pause. I'm very grateful to you for these comments that you've raised, and I think it has sharpened what I started talking about before. It's added depth and texture and helped us to explore in a few different directions, so thank you for that. I want to say two other things. In a second, I'll ask if there's anything you want to add just in closing, but before I say that, to the listeners, hope this has been helpful to you, and if it has raised particular questions which you think could helpfully be addressed either just pastorally, by Pastor Neil or me, or at All Saints, or in a podcast like this, don't hesitate to get in touch. It's always a pleasure to hear from people. And I think we might well come back and address this homeschooling versus different kinds of schools question, because I think that's something that a lot of young families at All Saints might benefit from. So if that's you, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. Nate, thank you for being here. Anything finally you want to just leave us with?
Thanks for having me. It's a good discussion, and appreciate your work and thoughtfulness on these topics.
Right, well, trying to push back the frontiers of ignorance, as my old PhD supervisor used to say.
Okay, that sounds great.
All right, well, listen, thank you, Nate. To the listeners, thank you all. I hope you've found this helpful, and I think that's all from us. God bless, and bye for now.